Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen, welcome back to Sunday morning and the old cookbook show. Today we're going to do a recipe out of this cookbook sent in by a viewer. Thank you, we absolutely love getting these old cookbooks in the mail. This is called Our Own Book of Recipes, compiled by Miss Franklin Keeley. And the dates given are February 27th, 28th, March 1st, 1930. Now this was a community cookbook, a fundraising cookbook for the school in this community. And it looks like they got a really good turnout from people in the community giving recipes. And each recipe is attributed to someone and where they live within the community. There's some from the vicarage. I'm going to do a recipe called meat roll. This is on a page with 4 other recipes that are essentially the same. 3 of them are really close. The 4th one is a variation. It's something that today, in today's world, here in Canada, probably in the United States as well, that we would call a variation on a meatloaf. They're all calling it a meat roll or a mold. 3 of them are steamed. The one that we're going to do today is steamed in glass jars for 3.5 hours, and they're all eaten cold. They're let cool, kept cold, and then sliced off and served that way. At its core, it's a super simple recipe. So we're going to start out with some ground beef and ground ham. So let's talk about this ground ham. The recipe actually calls for beef steak and raw ham, and then you're supposed to chop it up and grind it. I went to the grocery store and bought it pre-ground. Now, a couple weeks ago, I did a recipe for a pork, bean, and hominy stew or soup. In that recipe, I held up a piece of pork that I had bought that day, and it was a slice of ham. It was sold as fresh ham. And so ham, this is where language changes, and this is where you get into a minefield with some of these cookbooks. Language changes over time, or the meaning of certain words changes over time, especially in culinary terms. Things change, morph, and move on. And then they change from region to region on top of that, beyond the overall changes. So in this time period, 1930 and earlier, in English, when something called for ham or raw ham or fresh ham, what they meant was just the raw meat from the leg of a pig, from the ham of the pig. They didn't mean cured ham. Today's money, 2023, probably since the 1960s, if someone says ham, what they mean is the cured product, the smoked product. The word cured is understood, and we just don't use it anymore. It's just called ham. Before this time period, though, when someone said ham, what they really meant was raw, fresh pork. And if they meant the cured or smoked version, they said cured or smoked ham. What's changed is the understood modifier in front of ham. Okay, so I'm going to hit it with a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper. This is the only seasoning in here, so let's put a little more salt in there. The recipe also asks for breadcrumbs, and so I've opted today to use these finely ground breadcrumbs. And today, when you see breadcrumbs in a recipe, asks for breadcrumbs, this is probably what you're going to use. This is what you're going to grab for. Again, this is what you understand to mean breadcrumb. A couple weeks ago, I did a recipe for a mock apple pie from the 1850s. And the recipe asked for breadcrumbs. And what I used were these. What people today would call a dried bread cube. But in the 1800s, that would be considered a breadcrumb. And so I walk through this minefield of what we would do today versus what would be done historically, and trying to figure out where those things change geographically and through time. You can't look at a recipe even from the 1930s, which is almost 100 years ago. You can't look at a recipe from the 1930s and think that you know what's going on. You have to kind of find the context. You have to read through the rest of the book. You have to look at other books. If you just look at one and think you know what's going on, you don't. And if I've got caught out a lot of times on that, where I've read further down the road and I said, oh, well, I really made a mistake there, didn't I? Now, we just need to mix this together, and the best way to mix it together is use your hand. Just get in there and give it a really good mixing until you get something that's nice and homogeneous. Now the recipe says to steam in a jar for 3.5 hours. I looked around at the jars I had downstairs. Because we're going to cool this and serve it cold, I was looking for a wide mouth jar that didn't cut in at the top so that I'd be able to actually get them out. So I think I'm going to have to split this between 2 jars. Now, I've been making content on YouTube for a very long time, since 2007. Pains me that I have to say this. Yes, I'm cooking this in a mason jar. We are cooking it in a water bath. We are steaming it for 3.5 hours. We are not preserving this. The jar is just a cooking vessel. It's not going to be shelf stable at the end. I don't have to use a pressure canner because I'm not canning anything. I'm just cooking it in a jar. The jar is just a mold. The other recipes, one calls for a pudding basin, which would have been fairly common in this time period in these kitchens, probably still is common in English kitchens today. And the third recipe asks for it to be cooked. You would roll it up into a cloth and steam it in a pudding cloth. I chose this one because I think a jar is better. Okay, the last little bit. And now I'll wash my hands. Okay, so I'm going to put the lids on. I've got a pot of water on the stove here. It is already boiling, just sort of at a bare simmer boil, not a rolling boil. And in the bottom of the pan, I've taken all of these canning lids, just the rings, and I've lined the bottom so that when the jar sits in, it's sitting on top of the canning rings, not on the bottom of the pot. That'll just allow the water to bubble and boil around it much easier. So I got the lid on, and I'm sealing it just to the point so that water, steam from the pot doesn't get inside. And here we go. First one in. Second one in. Lid on. I'll turn the temperature up just a little bit, and we'll see you in 3.5 hours. Now, after these cooked for 3.5 hours, or steamed in that pot, I cooled them down, put them in the fridge overnight, and so they've solidified really well. I've got a pot of water here. I'm going to heat the water up. I'm going to dip it into the water to hopefully loosen around the edges, and it might be easier to get out of the jar. I'll just slip that in there and see if it warms up. Okay, let's see if this just kind of pop. Oh, it does. It just pops right out. There you have it.
Hey, Glenn. Hey, friends. You're just admiring your... I don't know, what is it?
It's a meat roll.
Woo! Are we going down? Are we having a
going down to the Legion
for a meat roll?
Going to the Legion for the meat roll.
Okay. I don't know that this is what you win. I thought maybe it was head cheese, like just because of this.
I mean, yes, it's got some gelatin and some fat around the outside. It is essentially...
So what's the base meat?
It's pork and ground beef.
So is it like a summer... Oh, yes, chicken.
Oh, it's attracted chicken. Chicken's on the prowl. So there were 4 recipes on a page. They were all essentially the same thing. One of them was cooked in a pudding basin, steamed in a pudding basin. This one was steamed in the glass jar. Mm-hmm. One was just wrapped in pudding cloth and steamed. And then one was put in like a pressed pan.
Well, we haven't even tried it.
No.
You got a fork?
Yeah.
Fork. You've got 2 forks. Sorry, I don't even need to get a fork.
It's meant to be served cold with parsley. Oh, interesting. So that has an interesting texture. So it's
almost looks like a sausage.
Yeah, summer sausage almost. So let's cut a couple pieces off and we'll see how it goes.
It reminds me more of like a corned beef or a Spam or that kind of textured.
Oh, tinned corned beef.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a tinned corned beef or a tinned Spam or any of those types of meats. It's got that kind of texture and consistency to it.
The texture's right. It's got a touch of that corned beef, the tinned corned beef. Like, we're not talking sliced corned beef.
No. Like Herefords
or Fray Bentos, that kind of thing.
I can see how parsley would go with it really nicely, though.
Parsley would go, and I mean, it's lacking in the spice department because there's only salt and pepper. You could really spice that up, and that would be
That's why they have the parsley on it after.
that'd be really
Little
good
hot
on
sauce?
really good on sandwiches if it was spiced properly. I could see how this. So this comes from an area of England that, by the time this book was published, the coal mines were closed. But I could see a generation before how this could
Take that with you
you would take this with
easily.
you.
Yeah.
You know, or slice a couple slices off with some hearty bread and you take it in your lunch, and that's your lunch. So this is a great idea. But for today's taste, I don't think it has enough flavor to please most people.
That's easily changed.
Yeah,
Easily changed.
easily changed.
This would be a summer picnicky kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, so meat roll. Not as crazy as I at first thought it was going to be. Actually quite good.
There you go.
Probably something to play with and give a chance. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.